The church is celebrating Pentecost, commemorating the events of Acts chapter 2. And I want to suggest that Pentecost is incarnational. You might think of that as being a Christmas word or a Christmas theme, but I want to suggest that Pentecost is in fact incarnational. Now, first of all, Pentecost is a movable feast. It doesn't fall like Christmas does on the same day every year. That's because it follows the Jewish calendar and the lunar cycle. So we have Easter that coincides with Passover, and we have Pentecost, also known as Sherwood, following 50 days later. And that's where the term Pentecost comes from, of course, penta meaning 50. So Passover commemorates the protection of the children of Israel from the angel of death when they were in Egypt. And then they went 7 weeks into the wilderness, and then the law was given, and that is what was being celebrated at Pentecost. The symbolism then is unmistakable. Jesus' death during Passover is a sacrifice that brings life, and the gift of the Spirit during Pentecost, celebrating the gift of the law on Mount Sinai. Well, you might ask, the law and the Spirit? Well, here's some text where we see that connection. I will put a new spirit in them. I will put my law in their minds and write it in their hearts. And the Apostle Paul writes, you are a letter from Christ, written not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So that pretty clearly ties the law of Moses to the gift of the Spirit at Pentecost. But the gift of the Spirit is part of this 50-day period at both ends. It was that resurrection Sunday. On the third day, Jesus appeared to his disciples and said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. So he breathed on them, we have wind, and he invited them to receive the Spirit. But 50 days later, there was another mighty rushing wind, and they received the Spirit. And one big thing to note here too is that Jesus is saying, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. So this is a missional moment, and I would say it's an incarnational moment. The receiving of the Spirit is tied to the manner of Jesus' own sending and to the manner of our sending. Well, again, we think of the incarnation as being in story form part of the Christmas story, the baby in the manger, the shepherds in the field, and so on. Those events are recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and they're in poetic form in the Gospel of John. But even the Gospel of Mark, which launches very directly into Jesus' adult ministry without a nativity story per se, hints strongly at incarnational themes. And this is a little bit complicated. I hope you'll stay with me for this. In the first 2 chapters of Mark, there's one Greek word and its variations that's used about 30 times. And you can see it here, highlighted in yellow. It's the word erchomai. So credit to the late biblical scholar Dr. Glenn Stassen, who pointed this out. For instance, Jesus went out. He could not enter a town. People kept coming. Jesus had returned. Some men came with their paralyzed friend. Well, we use variations in the English translation of that, but in the original Greek text, this repetitious use of erchomai makes a subtle, but I think a clear point about being with people, being present, being with and among them. And so the incarnation isn't just about the divine taking on human form and living inside a human body. It's about dwelling with us, being present. And so Dr. Stassen's intriguing lecture was still fresh in my ears when I read Acts chapter 2, and I noticed something I hadn't fully appreciated. During Pentecost, many people back in Jerusalem for this important feast, and before 9 in the morning, the third hour of the day, the disciples were praying in an upper room. And we don't know, but maybe the same upper room where Jesus had said, receive the Holy Spirit. And there was the sound of mighty rushing wind and tongues of fire that rested on each of them. Not perhaps the neat little flamelets that gently sit above the heads of people sitting in neat rows. It was chaotic. The description of that wind can be translated as violent, roaring, impetuous, or mighty. So maybe less neat and tidy and a little more chaotic, and I love these depictions of it. Well, they moved out into the streets talking with others, and here's the thing. It wasn't the listeners who could miraculously understand what these Galileans were saying in Greek or Aramaic. It was the disciples who began preaching in the languages that weren't their own. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians. The crowd asks, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? And this is my point. There wasn't a message in a foreign language about the wonders of God that these listeners could miraculously understand without speaking Greek or Aramaic. That would have been amazing, of course. But the listeners heard that message in their native language. It was the speakers who changed in how they were able to communicate new words and new language. I kind of played around with the graphic to try and depict this. Not just one crowd of people all the same and the Spirit coming to each of them in all the same way, but different people and different ways of hearing that story and different ways of carrying the story to others. And so is Pentecost something we remember and celebrate, or something we experience? Does the Spirit blow into our lives in sometimes unpredictable and chaotic ways? And then does that story carry on to those around us without them needing to learn our language and vocabulary and customs? This incarnational movement, exemplified by Jesus in his life and ministry, is towards people. The Spirit is also moving toward people and accommodating them, serving people where they are. May you know these tongues of fire in your native tongue, and may others know these tongues of fire through you in their native tongue.